not heard. So youth, this is definitely your call, and we want you to feel like you have access to ask the questions and get the information. And something that's been cool is that every person we have asked, including Dr. Harrist, who is quite busy in this time right now, every adult that we are, really hardworking person right now we've asked to come and speak to this group has said yes, which is pretty powerful. I don't think we would have gotten the same response for an average group of adults across the state. And so I think we want you guys as youth to know that your leaders want to stay connected to you and want to know what you're thinking and answer your questions. And so if this is your first time on, we do a kind of a Q&A format. So we'll hand it over to Dr. Harrist, and she can kind of give us just a general update on what she's working on and what the current stats are. And we have a few questions that we'll start with. Michelle and I will kind of help moderate. And then any questions that you have, just type them in the chat window. And if you would, type your community. We can see your name when you type. So type your community and your question in case that helps give a little bit of context. So we'll have Dr. Harris take off, and then we'll also try to kind of keep you all muted so we don't get background noises and siblings coming in and out or whatever's happening at everyone's house right now. So if you do end up talking, make sure you take yourself out of mute, but you can just use the chat window for now to ask any questions that you have, or any technology related questions too, if you have any issues. You guys are more savvy than most of us, so hopefully that's not, but if you have questions, feel free to ask them.
Yeah, and I encourage you guys, sorry, real quick, to put it on speaker view for this part. I know it's helpful to have gallery view when we're all getting in there, but speaker view is sort of helpful to eliminate some of the noise.
Awesome. And then the last thing, we are recording this so that we can put it online for other youth who are in class right now and couldn't make it to be able to join. So we put last week's up. If you weren't here and you want to see it, it's on the leadershipwyoming.org/youth connection page, and you can watch that, and we'll put this one there as well. So with that, Dr. Harrist, we'd love to turn it over to you to share a little bit about what you're seeing with COVID right now and what we should know as interested citizens across the state. I can't see you. You might be on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you all. This is certainly an outbreak that is going to, or probably has already affected everybody, since probably most of you should be in school right now. But one in that we all really have a role to play in helping to slow transmission of this virus. And I saw that Governor Gordon and Dr. G preceded me, so I know I have big shoes to fill. They're both fantastic. So yeah, really excited to be here, and thank you again. So I think I'll just start with, describing a little bit about this virus and how everything started. I think most of you are aware that, no one knew anything about this virus until it popped up in China in December. There was a cluster of pneumonia in a city called Wuhan, China. At first, most of the cases were linked to a specific outdoor animal and seafood market. And so at first we thought maybe it was being transmitted from animals to people, but it became very clear within the next several weeks that the virus was also being transmitted from person to person. And now, only just a few months later, here we are where essentially it's now a pandemic, meaning that it's a new virus. It's a virus that's affecting most countries in the world and causing a significant number of infections and, unfortunately, deaths, which we've seen. Why do we worry so much about new viruses? We know that this is a respiratory virus. It resembles in many ways respiratory viruses that we're familiar with, like influenza. So why are we so worried about this one? And new viruses in general? And it's because no one in the world really has been exposed to it before. We know that influenza season comes around every year. The influenza viruses change a little bit every year, which was why we need a new vaccine every year, but our bodies have some level of immunity. We've built up some defense against most of these viruses. And so we don't have an entire population that's essentially susceptible to these viruses. But when a new virus comes out, that's not true. None of us have seen it before. None of us have any level of immunity. And so we all have the potential of getting sick. And of course, when there's new viruses like this one, we don't have vaccines yet. We don't have specific treatments or drugs that we know help to either protect you from getting or from treating the virus once you get it. And so that's another real reason for concern and why pandemics are such a big deal like this one. And this particular virus, we know too that most people are going to have a relatively mild illness. People may get fever and cough and feel ill for a few days, but most of us who get it are going to be, again, sick for a few days, but then are able to recover at home. But certain groups of people are more likely to become severely ill from this virus. And from what we know so far, it's people who are over 65, people who may have underlying health conditions like heart disease, lung disease, or diseases that affect the ability of their immune systems to fight the virus, and that these groups of people are more likely to become ill and potentially die from this virus. However, even those of us who aren't going to get very sick from the virus are able to spread it to others, which is why it's important for all of us to take the precautions that I know you're already taking so that we can help prevent the spread to other people who may get more sick from the virus. So I think maybe, and I meant to start with this, but I'll start it now, is what do I do? What do we do at the Department of Health? So I'm the state health officer and the state epidemiologist, meaning it's sort of my job to oversee our disease and infection tracking at the state, as well as control of infectious diseases and tracking. So on a regular basis, we're tracking all types of diseases, both infectious and non-infectious in Wyoming, to try to inform our efforts to prevent people from getting sick. So we track diseases like, gastrointestinal diseases that might cause nausea and vomiting. So things like E. coli and salmonella. We track influenza, viruses that we hope to prevent through vaccination, like measles and mumps, bacterial diseases like pertussis, and also diseases that are spread to us through animals, such as plague and tularemia, and West Nile viruses that we get from mosquitoes, those types of things. So some of you may have gotten a call from us, or your family might have gotten a call from us if you're diagnosed with salmonella, for example. We'd give you a call and try to get at, where you might have gotten the salmonella, so that if we identify a source, we can protect other people from also getting salmonella, as well as give you recommendations for how you can prevent giving salmonella to other people, whether it's, staying at home, washing your hands, etc. So we're doing that with this new virus. We've developed laboratory testing so that we can test people for the virus. I'm sure you've all heard in the news that no one in the US, unfortunately, has enough tests to be able to test everyone who may have the virus. And that's certainly a limitation in this outbreak that we're all trying really hard to correct. But we can test people who may have the virus. We're also tracking the virus. So on our website, health.wyo.gov, we have a COVID-19 page that tracks how many cases we've diagnosed in the state, where in terms of which county they're located, gives you some statistics. So, what are the ages of people who are getting the virus, how many have been hospitalized, what we think the likely sources of the virus. So whether it's maybe you traveled, or maybe you have known contact with somebody else who had the virus, or whether it's potentially community spread, which I'm sure is a term that you've heard before. Community spread is when people are getting the virus without a real known exposure, just going about their sort of daily lives in the community without known exposure to somebody who is sick. So we see community spread of influenza every year, and we're seeing community spread of COVID-19 right now in multiple places in Wyoming and throughout the United States. So we're making a few different efforts to try to control the spread. So one is through our case follow-up. So everyone who's diagnosed with COVID-19, we call them. We do an interview and try to get at, again, some of these questions. You know, did you travel? Did you have known contact with anybody who was sick? Are you a healthcare worker? And then we also make recommendations for what they can do to help prevent spread to other people. And so when you're sick and you have the virus, what we're going to recommend is that you isolate yourself or put yourself in isolation, meaning stay at home and try to be at least 6 feet away from other people in the household throughout the time that you're sick. And we also ask them about their close contacts. So who have you had close contact with during the time that you were sick and also the couple of days before you developed symptoms? Because we know that this virus is spread through close contact, spread mainly through close contact between people. So that's, you know, having 2 people within 6 feet of each other for at least 10 minutes, which gives the opportunity for the virus to be spread if you produce respiratory droplets. So if you cough or sneeze, those sort of droplets that come out of your mouth or nose and can infect other people. And so we actually recommend that the close contacts put themselves in quarantine. And quarantine is when you're not sick, but we know you've been exposed to the virus, and we ask you to stay home for 2 weeks after your last exposure. So that isolation and quarantine are 2 really powerful public health tools we have to help prevent spread of the virus between people. But the other tools that we have, they're called community mitigation strategies or social distancing strategies, both terms that people are using a lot in this outbreak. And that essentially means asking people to stay away from each other as much as possible, because we know a couple of things. First, we know that people can have no symptoms but still have and spread the virus. And that the most effective way to prevent transmission is to essentially stay at least 6 feet away from everybody else. So those, you know, that's the reasons for some of the public health orders that we've made. Those are the orders that close down things like restaurants, movie theaters, gyms, places where we know that people are meant to gather. People are meant to come gather and sit within 6 feet of each other. So to ensure that people aren't going to those places to gather, because those are probably good places where the virus can spread. Another order is the social gathering limit order. So limiting gatherings to 10 people or less to ensure that if there is virus transmission within a close gathering like that, that it's only a limited number of people who are exposed. And then lastly, orders to close down businesses in which you can't avoid having close contact with somebody. So those are the nail salons, the hair salons, the massage therapists, and things like that. And so those are very difficult decisions to make. We know that these are important businesses, both for people and the people who run the businesses. But knowing that we still, you know, in some fashion need to have close contact with each other, through certainly medical providers. People need to seek medical care. People need to go to the grocery store and get food. People need to go to pharmacies to get their medications. You know, what are places we can at least limit the contact so that people can continue to get the essential services that they need? So our goal in this outbreak is to really slow the transmission. We know that the virus is here. I don't think anyone thinks we're going to just stop it at this point, but we want to slow the rates that people are getting infected with the virus. And there are a few reasons why. The first is that if everybody gets sick at once, those people who get, you know, really sick are going to need to go to the hospital. So if we have a lot of people sick at once that need to go to the hospital, our hospitals might not be able to handle all of those patients on top of all of the normal patients that they're going to have. People are still going to continue to have heart attacks and need to be hospitalized for other reasons as well as COVID-19. So we're trying to slow it down so that we have fewer people needing to go to the hospital at any one time. And of course, we'd like to slow it down while we have time to develop more and better testing because if we're able to test people and know that they have it, we're really able to more effectively implement these control measures that I talked about before, and also to give us time to develop a vaccine and to identify treatments that are going to be effective against this virus, both of which will be really powerful tools in prevention when we have them. So I think I will stop there. The specific statistics and stuff can be found on our website. I'm certainly happy to take questions about if people have questions about any of those. And yeah, happy to have a discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Harrist. One of the questions we've been asking each of our speakers is, does this feel like anything that's happened in your life previously? Like, is it, do you have something that you can relate to, or is it truly unprecedented? So we'd love to hear from your world if that's the case.
Sure. So for me, for something that's happening, you know, at my home in Wyoming, this is unprecedented. I did have the opportunity to go work in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak there, and that was in 2014 and 2015. So I was in Sierra Leone. And there are a lot of similarities between the Ebola outbreak there and now sort of the COVID-19 outbreak around the world, in that there are many people infected, and that really just really the whole society had to change how we normally act. So there they had shut down schools, they had limited gatherings, they had to change the way that they did church services and funerals. So really sort of had to adapt their very important social structures in order to combat the virus. So I would say that it is a similar experience to that, but certainly different being in the United States and have it happen, you know, here in our home. I don't think I ever would have expected to write, you know, the type of orders that we've written that close down businesses, that prevent gatherings. So this is, you know, from my standpoint, pretty unprecedented here in the United States. I think people can look back and read about the 1918 pandemic influenza outbreak and see some similarities there in the types of actions that were taken. But this is pretty, yeah, I would say it's pretty unprecedented.
Yeah. One other sort of moderator question, and then we'll start asking questions just from the students, which, reminder to the audience, please type your questions in the chat box. I'm interested in what lasting effects you think this might have on both the medical industry and society as a whole. Yeah.
Sure, thanks for that. I think, you know, from the medical public health side, I think we realized that we didn't have that we need to be better prepared to do some things. I think implement widespread testing sooner. I think that's a really important change that we need to make in the next situation like this. I think that's one very important lesson learned. I think from the, you know, from a societal standpoint, I mean, I think we're probably going to think, you know, think maybe a little bit more hard about some of our social traditions, like shaking hands or hugging, and whether you know, whether in all circumstances we want to do that or take some of those extra precautions going forward. You know, as a health department, we talk about and recommend people wash their hands all of the time. So it's not new for us, but I would hope that people, you know, that's a recommendation that also people take going forward, because while washing your hands is such a simple recommendation, it really is the most effective way of preventing yourself from getting infected. There are some great videos out there. There's one of a nurse who sort of demonstrates with some dyes about how easy it is when you're touching something, and then how easy it is to sort of get that all over your face without even realizing it. So I do think that some of these lessons that we've learned that we should consider moving forward.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And looks like Cassandra from Rock Springs was interested in knowing, do we expect there to be a huge peak in Wyoming cases anytime soon, or at all? Do you think we're able to avoid it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question and a difficult one to answer. There are a lot of models out there that you can find on the internet, sort of trying to predict what it will look like in the United States and in Wyoming, what the peak will look like, what our interventions will do to change that peak. Certainly the goal of the interventions we've done so far is to sort of push the peak out and make it smaller. I think that we still have a lot of evidence to look at, and we'll need to give it some more time to understand exactly what that will look like. Our hope is that our peak is sort of broad and smaller than it would have been if we hadn't put anything into place.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we're all hoping for that, definitely. And sort of a related note, Brady from Casper is wondering sort of if you have any insight as to why we haven't had any reported deaths in Wyoming so far.
Yeah, that's another good question, and one that I was asked yesterday as well. Again, I don't think there's one answer. I think we have to also, we all know in Wyoming, we're the smallest state in terms of number of people. And so we're going to have fewer deaths and fewer cases just for that reason than other states. And, we know that there have been severely ill patients in Wyoming, patients that we were worried weren't going to make it, but they received fantastic medical care and were able to recover. And that's great. I do hope that continues. But, I think it's still important to remember that this virus is very serious. We don't have a treatment for it, and that there are some people who are going to get very, very sick. And I do think, unfortunately, it's likely that we are going to see some deaths in Wyoming.
Yeah. Dolan from Jackson was asking, which is sort of related, I guess, maybe we have some time to think of solutions before that starts becoming a problem. There's been talk in the media about chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine as possible remedies. Is that evidence-based? It's hard to decipher right now sort of what's myth and what's fact.
Yeah, that is very difficult to decipher because there is sort of competing goals. You want to be able to identify these treatments and get them out fast if they do help people. But usually when you're studying the effectiveness of therapies and drugs, these are long-term studies so that you can both not only understand how they're working against the virus, but also understand any sort of downsides, any side effects that the drugs might cause. So chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine are some of them, a couple of the more studied drugs, and a couple of the drugs that have shown more promise. These drugs are actually already used against malaria. So they fight the parasite malaria, and then hydroxychloroquine is also actually used in diseases such as lupus and rheumatoid arthritis as sort of an anti-inflammatory. So a couple of advantages to these drugs that we already have used them and know some things about them. There's not enough evidence right now to say, great, these work against the virus, they are, they're safe and we should use them for everybody. There's not enough evidence for that yet. There are clinical trials going on around the country and around the world on these drugs as well as others. Though for those two drugs, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, the Food and Drug Administration and the FDA has released an emergency use authorization. So essentially saying, we haven't had enough time to fully study these drugs, but think that they may have some benefit. And so give sort of instructions to providers, here are some situations in which to consider using these drugs, in particular severely ill hospitalized patients who may not have any really other good options. And so there is some of that flexibility for providers to try these drugs in their patients outside of a clinical trial.
Yeah. Excellent. Josh from Casper is wondering a little less of a technical question. Sort of as a leader right now, how do you sort of believe that leaders should be speaking and acting, and how do you personally find inspiration and hope during a time like this?
Yeah. So I think that the job of leaders is to be very honest and truthful about what's happening. I think we all want to say everything's okay, we're all good, everything is going to be okay. But I think we have to be really honest about, what we know and also what we don't know. I mean, we certainly don't know everything about this virus, and I can't predict, and no one can predict what exactly is going to happen. But I also think it's very important to communicate, what people can do. This is not just something where people have to sit back and watch the disaster happen, but there are real actions that people can take to protect themselves and their communities and their families. So to make sure that people have the information that they need to be able to make those types of decisions. I think there's a lot of, inspiration and hope out there. I'm lucky in that, most of us know our colleagues across the country. And so I find a lot of comfort and great information in talking with them and understanding how things are similar for them as they are here, or maybe different for them as they are here, and are able to help each other out in that way. What's worked in maybe another state, hey, maybe we can try that here in Wyoming. And I think just probably like everybody, I get a lot of inspiration from my family and making sure that they're all doing the right thing, or as they're spread out through the country, checking in on them. My mom is a cardiologist or a heart doctor in New York City, so is really there on the front line, seeing what's happening. So just hearing about the great work that she's doing is always inspiring to me.
Awesome. Yeah. And Mackenzie from Lander is wondering, Dr. Fauci has estimated that schools will reopen in the fall. Do you share this sentiment with Wyoming schools, or do you think that's unpredictable at this point?
Yeah, I think certainly that's something that we're looking at and discussing, every day really is when, how long do things need to be closed? How long, when can we start opening things up? As a scientist, I really like to make my decisions based on the evidence. So my preference is always, of course, well, let's see what the evidence looks like closer to the time. But I totally understand that people want to be able to plan and know, whether they're going to be in school this spring or not into the fall. And so trying to balance both of those things. So I don't have an answer to that yet for Wyoming, but know that it is something that we're considering really every day and looking at every day. And as soon as we feel like we can make that decision, we'll make it early if we can, so that people can plan for what to do.
Yeah.
Maybe a little plug for next week is that Superintendent Jillian Balo has actually agreed to speak to us next week and answer some of your questions about school. So she oversees all of the school districts in Wyoming. And so she won't, probably won't have any more of a decision to offer you in a week, but you can have some of your questions answered.
Excellent. Yeah, and it looks like a couple more questions. Kennedy from Rock Springs is wondering, you touched on people with underlying conditions being more susceptible. How is this affecting patients who are regularly needing hospital treatment anyway, like cancer patients? Is this disastrous for those people?
Yeah, so it's certainly something to be concerned about. Anytime that someone has an immune system that doesn't function the way that it normally does, so like cancer patients or patients with diabetes or some other conditions as well, yes, we certainly worry that those people are more likely to experience severe infections.
Maybe one follow-up question to that. What are they doing in hospitals? Babies are being born, cancer patients are getting treatments. How are they handling the attempt to kind of avoid any sort of exposure or something like that?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So, some of you may have noticed there have been a lot of changes in hospitals, one of which is that many are not allowing visitors or not, or restricting the number of visitors that can come in, which it can be difficult because when patients are sick, it's certainly very helpful to have family members there. But the goal of that is to make sure that visitors aren't bringing in virus that could potentially then go on to infect, sick patients or healthcare workers who then wouldn't be able to work. Hospital providers, there's very specific equipment. It's called personal protective equipment, or PPE, that can be used to protect against transmitting this virus between one person and another. So healthcare providers are wearing special kinds of masks. They're called N95 respirators. They're made to specifically protect against specific viruses and bacteria that are very small and can, potentially get through other types of masks. They wear face coverings or eye shields because you don't want splashes into the eyes, and then gowns and gloves. So what they're trying to do is really separate patients who might have coronavirus from others in waiting rooms especially, but then also within the hospital, make sure that providers are, of course, always washing their hands between patients, but then using the correct personal protective equipment as well. And if that's done effectively, that's very effective at preventing transmission within the hospitals themselves.
Thank you.
Yeah, another interesting question from Hannah from Rock Springs, which I'm interested. There's been some reports in the news about animals testing positive. I know I saw one that a tiger tested positive in a zoo somewhere. She's interested, can it be spread? First of all, how is it being spread to animals? And can it be spread sort of from animals to humans? I know we've talked about it became a human to human problem. But yeah, I'd love to learn more about that.
Yeah, and that's an area we certainly have more to learn, but the evidence that we have now, so first of all, it's likely that this was an animal virus at some point and then somehow developed the ability to infect humans. And so at some point there was some animal to human contact that led to us getting the virus. There are some theories on what animal that was. Bats tend to have a lot of different types of coronaviruses. So whether it's a bat coronavirus that then, infected humans directly or sort of went through another animal and got to humans, I think we'll learn more about that as people are able to study the specific virus. But there have been studies sort of looking at pets and whether the virus can infect pets. And the most recent, and there's still a lot to be left, there's still a lot left to learn, but it seems like that potentially cats can get the virus, from people, probably if we're coughing or something around our cats. The cats can have some symptoms, and then it's unclear whether the cats can then spread it back to humans. I think that there's still some question about that. And this is all very preliminary because we're still really learning more. But yes, and so then there was a tiger at, I believe, the Bronx Zoo that did test positive and was having symptoms apparently from reading in the news. And so sort of more evidence that potentially cat species are able to get the virus and be symptomatic. Again, whether they can then transmit it back to us, I think is still unknown. So I think cats right now, but I think we'll learn more about this as we go on. I think there are other types of animal studies being done as well.
Dr. Harrist, maybe in kind of a similar vein of question, how quickly is this virus able to morph or change to become either more dangerous or, more contagious? We sort of already think it's at the upper end of a couple of those things, but what is the concern of it could get actually way worse for the virus?
Yeah. And so people have started to look at that already. Even we here in Wyoming, we send our viruses to a special lab where they can do whole genome sequencing. So essentially understand the entire RNA readout of the virus. And by looking at that, you can look at how rapidly it's changing. Are we seeing mutations that may affect its ability to spread between people or may make it be more serious? Right now, it doesn't seem like it's changing very fast, that it really is sort of the same virus that's going around the world, which I think is a good sign. It's always easier to combat a target that's not changing very fast. But we will certainly, keep doing that, and the U.S. will keep doing that as time goes on to be able to understand, does this virus change?
One other question. I know Wyoming is not only one of a few states that doesn't have a shelter in place order. Are there certain criteria that would, pull that lever or say, okay, we've reached the point that has to happen? Or how does that decision get made at your and Governor Gordon's level?
Sure. So yeah, and us in the governor's office, we're really checking in on this every day to determine, again, what, the orders that are in place, are those sufficient or do we need anything else? Do we need to put other strategies in place? I think there's really, the whole entire situation is something that we always have to take into account. So I don't think there's one specific number or one specific threshold we reach when we say, okay, now we need to take an additional step. And it's really the big picture, and in particular the big picture in two kind of in places. One is, what is the virus doing? You know, are we still seeing increases in number of cases? Are most people getting it from known sources versus community transmission? So what does the outbreak look like? But then it also depends what our hospital systems look like. So are our beds full? Do we have enough staff? Do we have enough ICU beds and ventilators? So I think those are two of the really big kind of categories we'll look at in determining whether we need additional steps in place.
Thank you. Michelle, I'll let you ask another question from the students.
Yeah, it looks like Josh from Casper, I think you touched on this maybe with the testing already, that in a future situation like this, we might be better prepared with testing. Are there any other things we've learned from this pandemic so far that might help us with future problems? Have there been failures that might eventually lead to successes if this were to ever happen again?
Yeah, I think, I think one is that, remembering how close we are to sort of everywhere in the world. Wuhan, China, I'd never heard of it before this outbreak. I'm sure most people hadn't, even though it's a city of millions of people and many times the size of Wyoming. And so I think that we really have to remember that an outbreak or condition anywhere is a possible threat to us here, because people are just traveling and moving around so much, which is great that we're able to do that and interact with people. So I think keeping that in mind and really remembering that health everywhere can affect our health here. So I think looking at places that might not have great healthcare systems or that might not have great public health systems, and thinking about how we can strengthen those so that we can prevent these types of things from happening again.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see what changes with our sort of practices as we move forward. It looks like Hannah from Rock Springs has another sort of technical question about, we've heard about vaccines being developed, and I feel like there's probably some conflicting information about whether it's some 6 weeks out or 2 years out. If you could just describe a little bit more about what the procedure to create a vaccine and test a vaccine would be.
Sure. So developing a vaccine is usually a very time and work intensive and expensive process. So, usually it's a big private kind of laboratory or pharmaceutical company that develops. They do a series of types of tests to determine whether it works and whether it's safe. So you sort of start out testing in smaller groups and make sure there is no side effects to the vaccine, and then you expand to larger groups and make sure that the vaccine works. So it usually is a process that takes years and involves thousands of people, which is why we know that the vaccines that we do have and recommend right now are so effective and safe. What Dr. Fauci, who's the one of the directors at the National Institutes of Health, we really want to speed up this vaccine process while still being able to make sure that it's both safe and effective. And so trying to conduct the trials, we need to do that in a faster amount of time. So, he said a year and a half would be fantastic if we could have a vaccine, and that would have been from March or so. That would be probably the fastest new vaccine development in history, again, which would be fantastic. But we do need to know that it's safe and that it works before we can recommend it to everybody.
A follow-up question to that too, what does it look like? So let's say in next March or next June, they say, okay, it's approved, we're doing it. How long does it take to vaccinate the world against something like this?
Yeah. Yep. And it's certainly it's something that we prepared for to be able to do what we call mass. Probably most of you don't remember, but some of you might remember the last pandemic, influenza in 2009, and the limiting factor there was that it takes time to produce, enough vaccine for everybody. But what would happen is, we'd get sort of shipments to Wyoming from the federal government, and we'd set up likely stations or distribute to providers. There may be certain groups of people that we recommend getting vaccinated first, like people who may be more susceptible to severe illness, and then have other groups sort of come in later. Certainly vaccinating the world is not an easy or fast process. It will likely be a stepwise process that is going to take some time. So it's a very good point that even once we have a vaccine, it's not like there's going to be a day and then suddenly everybody is vaccinated.
Yeah.
Great.
Related to the sort of vaccinating, I know sort of we've talked about like immunity can come from sort of the just constant exposure. We've read a little bit in the news about convalescent plasma, someone who's already been sick, maybe donating plasma to someone who is currently sick. Any thoughts on sort of whether that's effective, how we could even go about testing? Because I know sounds like it's a different test. Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so that certainly is a promising treatment. I think that it's always a limited treatment because there's only so many people who are going to have antibodies and who can donate blood. For people who are very sick and in the hospital and there's sort of no other options, we've seen that it can likely be effective, and same with Ebola, we saw that it could likely be effective. But you're right. For that, we need to do a test to detect antibodies, and those tests aren't quite as fully developed as the tests that we have now to diagnose the acute viral infection. And so I think it's something to watch. I do believe there's some trials going on with that as well. I don't know how easy it is to access right here in Wyoming. Somebody who may be able to if you think you've had COVID or you've had COVID, to draw your blood to be used. But I think it's definitely something to watch. And certainly the best is for everyone to have their own immunity through vaccination. But in the meantime, while we don't have that, using other people's antibodies to help fight the virus for you is absolutely something that's very promising.
And we'll maybe ask one more question from Brady, and then we will let you get back to your very busy schedule. Brady was curious, and your answer may not be, you're working in the scientific and doctor realm, but he's curious, what are your thoughts on the impact of something like the presidential election and the issues that we're seeing in a lot of the primaries of not being able to vote, or that it's a public health concern to gather people? What thoughts do you have on how that shapes our future as well?
Well, yes, certainly not my area of expertise, and a very complicated but interesting question that's going to be very interesting to follow as we go on. Certainly I think, whether public health preparedness and public health is something that should be considered, when we're electing our leaders. Of course, I think that because that's my area. But yeah, I mean, it's true, with everything, it's very important for people to be able to get together and discuss these very important political issues, just like it's very important for people to get together and have religious services and funerals and weddings and things like that. But really, all of those things we have to do it differently now until we can know that it's safe to do it again with this virus. So I hopefully technology is in a place where we can facilitate a lot of those debates and important conversations remotely. But I absolutely do think it's going to be different, probably like we've never seen before for this upcoming election.
Thank you. And maybe one just personal anecdote too, as we say goodbye, but what's something that you're proud of, either personally or within your team or state government or across Wyoming? What's something you've seen that you feel really proud of in the last few weeks or month?
Yeah, I think, working together. Yeah, I think, as a state, we all have our sort of different jobs that we do. We do health, and, Department of Transportation does highway patrol and transportation, and Homeland Security does Homeland Security. But, something like this is not just a public health response. It's a really entire state response. So, we have things like the Wyoming Department of Transportation is driving around the state for us over the weekend, picking up samples and driving them back to our lab. They're driving supplies out from our lab and from, PPE supplies out to the hospitals. Homeland Security, when we have things like this, circumstances pop up that you don't anticipate. You know, when you're isolating and quarantine people, they may not be able to do that at home. They might not have a home to be able to do that. So how do you find places where people can stay? And so things like those are things that Homeland Security can help us with. So I just think the really combined effort that everybody is making for this, you know, for this public health incident.
Thank you. Well, thank you for sharing so much time with us and answering so many questions candidly and openly. And if any students feel like they didn't get a question answered, you can email Michelle or I. Our emails are on that website, and we can get it over to Dr. Harrist for hopefully an answer as well. We'll condense them, we promise. But thank you very much for being with us. So we'll say goodbye to Dr. Harrist. Thank you
so
much.
Thank you.
And then we're going to hand it back over to Tom Grogan for just a couple of minutes as a teacher and coach for NC, starting to teach virtual class again, and with a little bit of advice or suggestions for how you all start to engage in this new land of learning. So Tom, we've got about 5-8 minutes in there. And if folks have questions for Tom, you can chime in the chat window and we'll send them to Tom as well because he can't see them on his current screen.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. You know, I think that I just want to start this thing off by saying, you know, I can walk into a classroom pretty easily and have a conversation with my students and read their body language really easily and be able to interact pretty comfortably. And the truth is now through this virtual platform, it is really, really hard to have a conversation with kids and vice versa with, you know, student to teacher in this new world. So I think that me being on the Zoom meeting right now is difficult because I only see one face at a time. And so the ability for me to have just the like natural organic conversation is challenging. But I do have a couple of thoughts and some things that I've been stewing on for the last few weeks. And I want to start things off by just telling a quick story about a cattle rancher. This cattle rancher drove, you know, he has his chores and he did the same thing every single day. He drove a mile into his pasture to feed his cows and took the same path every single day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And over time, what eventually happens? Well, you have this massive rut that you get put into and you keep driving it. And truthfully, when you drive the same path, your tires go into the ruts and you end up not even having to use the steering wheel anymore. And I think that in the world of education, we've kind of been in that position now where we've created a rut for ourselves. And a lot of teachers and a lot of students, especially as they get into high school, have learned the game, so to speak, and just continue down this path with really focusing mostly on adult direction. And I think as students, it's really important for us to understand that our world is totally shifted and that we are in a very unique situation in education, and that as a student, you have the ability to create some direction for yourself. And I think it goes back to recognizing maybe ruts in your own life and things that you have put yourself into that are difficult to change. And if you can recognize what your ruts are, I think you have the ability to change your habits and form new ruts or form new direction. Every single one of us has the same amount of time every day. We get 24 hours. And, you know, just, I'm not a math guy, but I know that there's 168 hours every week. And for a lot of kids, you know, I'm crossing my fingers that my own kids are doing this, getting 10 hours of sleep a night. So if you put that together, and then, you know, right now, I would say that most kids are between the 5 and 7 hours of school online. That leaves all of us, or all of the teachers and students, with about 63 hours of time. And I think that without the ability now to be involved in extracurriculars, you know, that 63 hours can be used pretty significantly. And so my challenge is a couple of things. Number one, we've got to be able to find people and resources that can help us. And if we can find some direction and some things that we really want to focus on now that we have some extra time, I think that we can really push into that. I think every single person that's on this video cast or this Zoom right now is a leader. And if there is a way that you can spend some time, even if it's like a couple hours a day, sitting back and thinking about something that you really want to change or do in your community, in your house, in your state, if you could put 2 hours a day into trying to figure that out, holy smokes, you think about when this thing's all said and done, how much positive growth we can actually have. So a couple of just quick anecdotal things about what I'm seeing right now as a teacher. Number one, I think that there are a lot of kids, and I'm not trying to make it sound like I'm the teacher talking down to anybody, because I found myself in the same thing. But it's really easy to maybe stay up a little bit too late and wake up a little bit too late and not get yourself ready for the day and act like a normal employer, a normal employee, a normal student, etc. And so I just want to challenge some people to start your day with a win. Wake up. I don't know if anybody's read the book, Make Your Bed, but Admiral, he's a former Navy SEAL, had a really awesome piece of advice. Wake up, the first thing you should do is make your bed. Start your day with a win. And maybe you're not the bed making type. I'm not necessarily. But go get a workout in, go read a book, go do something that starts your day with a win. And if you can do that, boy, I think that it can start to just build and build and build. And if after you get done with your win, you have a routine in place. I think for me, this is our first week back in Casper. It was really hard for me the last 3 weeks to try to get a normal sense of routine, because I am used to giving people a hug, giving people a high five, giving people a handshake. And I love hugging my wife and my kids, but I need a little bit more than that. And so I've had to create a routine where I've had conversations with people that have been very, very intentional. And so I think for all of the people that are on this Zoom meeting, we've got a pretty awesome and unique opportunity right now to be the force of change, be the thing that is going to propel Wyoming, propel your communities into doing something that's never been done. Because the truth is, if you want something that's never been done, you have to do something that you've never done. And I think that for many of us, there's some fear and a little uncertainty in what that looks like. But if we can all maybe embrace a little bit of the challenge and understand that it's going to be a little uncomfortable, boy, I think that we can get ourselves going in the right direction. So that's my piece of advice for all of you students and anybody else who cares to listen as we move forward.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. I think now being in kind of week 4 of working from home and being in sort of self-isolation or, self-quarantine, I will say it does get easier. My husband and I both on Monday said it feels normal. It's been 3 weeks and we've changed our patterns and it actually feels normal now. And we don't want it to last forever. Like, we like hugging people. But you do get used to it the more that you sort of do it and practice it. So reach out if you have questions or you just need a little encouragement or support. I'm going to wrap us up so we can head out at noon. And for those of you on the beginning of the call, I have to go back out to be a unicorn to like 60 more families. But next week we're going to be meeting at 2 p.m. because Superintendent Balo had a standing meeting at 11 every single week. So she was never going to be able to join us at 11. So we will send all of you who we have your information. If you've got an email from us, we'll send you the update for 2 o'clock next week. And it's kind of cool. We're going to also be joined by a gold medal decathlete who won a silver medal in the 2004 Olympics and a gold medal in the 2008 Olympics in the decathlon. And he's going to talk a little bit about doing hard things. And he's just a really inspiring person. And so it'll be kind of a fun combination of head of all schools and then this Olympic athlete who will share his perspective too. So join us next week at 2. We'll send out an invite and it'll be posted on the LIFT website and the Leadership Wyoming website if you don't get it somehow that way. So yeah, thank you all for joining us. And thanks for all of your comments and questions. You guys continue to astound us at your insightfulness and just how aware you are of what's happening and how you want to help as well. So thank you guys for joining and have an awesome afternoon. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you all.